Chapter 4. The Journey. The summer of Taharka's 16th year was the same as any other. It was hot. Taharka's studies in soldiering continued, though the priest did not approve, throwing the javelin, bending the Cushite longbow, cutting and slashing with the new iron-bladed swords. What wonders they were! Nothing could survive against them. They could bend bronze as if it were silver. The weapons were full size now. Taharka's legs and arms and back were lengthening, his muscles beginning to ripple like a man's. Other things were different too. Somehow he saw very little now of his uncle Mbuta. When he thought about it, he missed the old soldier's reassuring presence during practice time, missed hearing his rough voice calling out, "Too slow! Great God, too slow! Move your sacred back!" Somehow, little by little, his brother Shabbataka had taken over his training. It was fun to work with Shabbataka, who never seemed to get angry, who patiently corrected his mistakes, then sat and talked with him as they sipped the unfermented grape juice and nibbled the unleavened honey cakes beside the lotus pool. But, in any event, in this summer of his 16th year, Taharka's mind was on other things. Preparations were being made for the journey, the great voyage down the Nile to Egypt, where he would become a married man. It was on Shabbataka's mind too. "And your name will finally be inscribed, on the stone, in the books of the priests." He looked at his brother from the corners of his eyes, a strange, speculating look. Taharka's mind was on something else. "It's almost 4 years since I've seen Shepnu. What will I say to her?" "Something formal," said Shabbataka. "It's strange. I don't really remember how she looked at all, just how I felt when they took her away." "Well," said Shabbataka, shrugging, "now you will have her back, for a little while, and meanwhile—" Again there was that veiled look. "Yes," said Taharka, "I must choose my companion." Shabbataka looked straight at him. "Will it be me?" Taharka felt a little shock. Long ago it seemed there had been no question. Of course it would be Shabbataka. But lately, for some reason, he had not wanted to think about it. "I don't know," he said. Shabbataka pretended to be hurt. "Don't you trust me? Don't you think I can keep the crops growing and the river flowing while you're off having fun in the big city?" "I don't know." He wasn't sure why he had said it. The old, unreadable mask settled over Shabbataka's face. For just a moment, Taharka felt a little thrill of warning. But Shabbataka only said, "I could do it." The afternoon sun falling upon his dark shoulders seemed to robe him in pride and dignity. Looking at him, Taharka thought, as he had thought so many times before, he should have been chosen. He had been born to it. So Shabbataka became his companion. He was given the right to wear the white crown of Cush, to carry the golden wand. The people would crawl to him, as he had desired, and in his hands would lie the fortunes of the land. The day following the ceremony, Taharka was carried in his sacred litter beneath his sacred umbrella to where his sacred barge waited at the bank of the sacred Nile. Because the barge was sacred, his feet were allowed to touch the deck, and he would be able to move about freely. He drew a deep breath. He would see all the sights. It was a magical journey, 30 days from Napata to Thebes, and, to begin with, for the first time he saw the great rapids. 4 times in those 30 days the current quickened and the barge was drawn up on land to be dragged by teams of men past the wild white waters churning over the rocks. Heave, 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 and the air was filled with a hymn of praise to Pharaoh. Was it like this, he wondered, for Pi Anki the Great when he had sailed forth to make Egypt one and glorious again? At all other times the river was at peace and only the banks teemed with life. There were great temples all along the way, and there were the villages of the farmers. The air hummed with water wheels cranking up the Nile water, emptying it through the sluices into the ditches that kept the fields green. At night it was full of the roar of the crocodile and the hippopotamus, sometimes of the lion and the hyena. There were towns and trading posts in the bustling cities of Carmen and Dongola. And, at the end of the final cataract, there was the great island of the sacred hawk for whom Taharka had been named, and he whispered to himself, "Now we are in Egypt." On the afternoon of the 30th day they came to Thebes. Taharka had grown up in a great city, but at the sight of Thebes he blinked. 2 great walls rose before him, one on either side of the river. They seemed to go on forever. Along the raised banks of the river itself were 2 endless lines of quays, where the dock workers swarmed loading and unloading the river boats, grain, fruits, cloth, vegetables, all the produce of the river banks. Above the walls rose the flat roofs of houses 4 or 5 stories high, and high above these glinted the gold-washed tops of needle-like red and white towers. As they drew closer to the east bank, Taharka saw the faces. Many were near black like his own, others were the various shades of dark to medium brown he found among his cousins and brothers and sisters. But the stories were true. Here and there were faces the color of cream and hair of brown or red. Taharka shook his head. So this was Egypt. They approached a great pier of white stone. He was placed upon his golden litter, and the umbrella raised above his head. Trumpets of bronze sounded forth. Taharka had been shy of the people in this strange place, but they fell to their knees before him, faces to the ground, just as they would have done in Napata, and the same cries rose into the air. Save us, great God, heal our ills, Son of the Sun, nourish our grain, bringer of the Nile, destroy our enemies, mighty hawk. The powerful little men who carried the litter trotted through a gate in the towering brick wall. Trot, 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 between brick warehouses and little brick wine shops, through a great marketplace where fruits, vegetables, jewelry, charms and hexes, papyrus books, inks, and anything else were sold under awnings of river reeds. Then trot, trot, trot into a great avenue paved with brick and lined with crouching stone lions with the heads of rams. Now he could hear the bleating and lowing of the animals to be sold for sacrifice, for the litter was approaching the temple of Amun, most holy of the houses of the god. The wall loomed high. The litter passed through a towered gate, and Taharka thought he would be struck deaf by the bawling and baaing, not to mention the cries of the people. Before him was a flight of steps, and on each side a giant stone figure, giant images of that mighty King Rameses II, that great god who had laid waste the land of Canaan. Bump, 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 up the steps, and the terrible noise began to fade into something like a far-off roar. Now they were in the most immense room Taharka had ever seen or even dreamt. The sun was hidden by a roof so high above Taharka's head that it was lost in shadows, and he could not see it, much less the tops of the mighty stone columns that supported it, columns to which Taharka and his attendants were like mice to men, columns painted and carved with gods and kings and sacred animals, so bright and beautiful even in the dimness that the young king's eyes were dazzled. There was the sound of singing in the great room. Among the giant columns, down a kind of avenue between them, came a procession of men with shaved heads and white linen skirts. For a moment Taharka lost some of his excitement and wonder. These men might have been priests in Napata, and sure enough they fell upon their knees and crawled to him, faces to the ground. Led by the priests, Taharka's procession moved on, out of the hushed hall of the columns into the sun again. And now Taharka's heart beat steadily faster, his eyes shone with awe. For ahead of him lay the dark walls of the oldest of all of Amun's houses, stretching back 1,000 years or more, the true house of the god. And within those walls lay the red chamber, the most secret and hidden place of all, the Holy of Holies. Here lay the oldest of all the images of Amun, and the sacred box in which he was carried once a year on his feast day. In all the world, only one person was allowed to see the inside of that chamber. That person was he, Taharka. Of all the unbelievable things, that was the hardest for Taharka to believe. But first they turned off into a small chapel where the kings of the two lands made their offering to Amun. A spotless ram had its throat cut. All present drank a little of its sacred blood and had a little smeared on their foreheads. It was then, looking away from the sacrifice, that he saw it. The figure on the litter, the layered headdress of linen and feathers, not a human being, but a statue, except that he could see its eyes move, which frightened him because this was certainly a goddess. He remembered that the high priestess in Thebes was more sacred than Pharaoh himself. Like Pharaoh, she wore the golden cobra coiled upon her brow. The crook and the flail were crossed upon her breast. The litter passed by him, and then it came to him. That statue was Shepnuset. What had they done to her? Was it Shepnuset at all? Terrible things were done in Thebes, he had heard. Had they locked her away somewhere and substituted this frightening image of a stranger to terrify him into obedience? A feeling of numbness settled over him, and then the high priest humbly asked if he wished to greet his divine father. Humbly, but of course it was a command. He was being commanded to enter the Holy of Holies. Suddenly Taharka turned cold with terror. He? To enter the Holy of Holies? It was as if the past 5 years had never happened. He was not the god. He should never have been the god. It was all an accident. Amun knew it, if anybody else did. If little Taharka, the son of the Bantu slave girl, were to enter that red chamber, what would happen? Amun would strike him dead. That was what would happen. The high priest spoke again, more urgently, asking if it would please the great god to come to his divine father, now. For the first time, here in this holy city, Taharka disobeyed the command of a priest. Slowly, languidly, he tilted back his head, half closing his eyes. It does not please me. I will rest now. And after all, as Shabbataka would have said, what could they do about it? The great god had spoken. In a silence shimmering with an undercurrent of shock, they carried him from the offering chamber and from the ancient court through other gates and passages into the great house of the king. Taharka felt the numbness leave him. This was more like what he was used to. No giant chambers and pillars here. The rooms were no larger than his rooms in Napata, the cedar wood stools and tables no finer. Even the great bed in the alcove had little more gold and silver on it than his great bed at home. He stretched himself on that bed now. Silent servants drew red linen curtains across long, narrow windows and crept from the room. Never had Taharka felt himself so alone. Tears gathered beneath his eyelids. He realized that there was no one here that he knew. Shabbataka and the priest of Sebek had chosen the attendants who would accompany him, some for their strength, some for their intelligence, some because they had traveled north before. Now Taharka realized that he barely recognized any of them. Anyway, he thought, what did it all matter? The day would come, it must come, when he would enter the Holy of Holies, lay his hands on the sacred image and place it in the sacred cask to be carried in procession. And when that day came, who could save him then? There was a little flurry at the door of the outer chamber, a whispering and, unbelievably, a kind of giggle. He sat up amazed, pushing aside the curtains of the sleeping alcove. Hari? It was not a little round girl who stood near the door. It was a tall, imposing young woman with innumerable black braids hanging over her shoulders, the tips tinted with gold. She wore a collar of gold around her neck. But it was not a statue, not a goddess. It was Shepnu. The first thing she said to him was, "Are you hungry?"